Hello and welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is where you're joining us from. Welcome to our first webinar of the academic year, at least of the academic year here in the Northern Hemisphere, here at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. If this is the first time you're joining us, I'm delighted to see you. My name is Rebecca Schendel. I'm the managing director here at CIHE. And if you're new to the series, just to say that we do a webinar every month, and we hope that you will join us at future ones as well as today. But I wanted to sort of start by saying welcome to what we have been discussing here is a year that in some ways feels quite normal as we look forward to a bit of a return to the way things maybe operated a few years ago, and in other ways doesn't feel normal at all. And I think that idea, which is sort of we've been all grappling with over the last few weeks, also brings us quite nicely into the topic for today. It also brings us nicely into the way we are continuing to operate, at least partially in a virtual mode. These webinars we started during the pandemic, and we will definitely continue doing them because we love the possibility that they bring for us to commune with our larger community on a monthly basis from all over the world. So thank you for being with us today. And thank you very much for our speakers for being with us today as well. Before I get into introducing them and actually launching the webinar, let me just remind you, it may be a bit rusty for some of you if you've been, as I say, here in the Northern Hemisphere and had a few months off webinars, but just to remind you of the logistics and the housekeeping of how our webinars work. We will kick off with some presentation, but we try to really privilege dialogue in these webinars, so there will be a lot of time for questions and answers. So I want to really urge you all to think about what questions come up. As you listen to our two speakers, I know that there are some real provocations that are going to be delivered, so I hope you will have some reactions and some questions that you want to bring into the discussion afterwards. Please do not feel that you have to wait until the Q&A to ask your questions, because the way we run our webinars is we actually ask you to post your questions in the chat, and I will bring them in at the end of the presentations. I have a few questions myself to kick off the discussion, and then I'll start bringing in questions from the chat. But please don't wait until then. If you have questions as you think of them, go ahead and put them in. In fact, we know from experience that we often have a lot of questions coming in at the very last minute, and we often can't get to those. So as questions occur to you, please go ahead and share them with us. Also, just a quick reminder that we do ask you to remain muted throughout the whole presentation, and also to keep your video off, just because that allows us to keep the spotlight on the speakers. We also suggest you might want to watch in speaker mode if you're watching the presentation. That allows you to see the slides more easily. So turning to the actual content of today, what we're doing today is looking at what is a really important phenomenon happening across higher education systems, particularly that started in the sort of acute pandemic period. I don't want to talk about the pandemic period as in past tense, because I'm not sure we're completely through it yet, but definitely during the really acute lockdown period, you started to see this phenomenon manifesting. And that's the phenomenon that's often been called the Great Resignation. And what we can see that in many sectors around the world, of course, but what we really wanted to look at today is how this phenomenon is manifesting in higher education, if at all. And we have two excellent speakers on the topic. We have with us today Kevin McClure, who is Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, here in the US. A major focus of Kevin's current scholarship and scholarship over the last few years has been on pandemic era workplace conditions and the related experiences of faculty, staff, and administrators. So we're really looking forward to hearing Kevin's thoughts on this topic. We also have with us Richard Watermeyer, who's Professor of Higher Education and also co-director of the Center for Higher Education Transformations at the University of Bristol in the UK. I guess it's fair to say Richard has been thinking about this topic through many lenses over the last few years. He's run a number of studies, including some multi-country studies that is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the well-being and mental health of faculty, also academics broadly, students and staff at higher education institutions in a number of national contexts. So we're delighted to hear from them today. As I say, we'll start with 10-minute presentations from each of them, and then we'll open up for some discussion. So at this point, I'm going to pass to Kevin, who is starting us off. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to learn from you all and to be part of this important conversation. So little known fact, because I have largely focused on US higher education for most of my career, but I actually did start in comparative and international education. And so my master's degree and PhD are both in international education policy. And so it's extra exciting for me to be part of this conversation and with this audience. So for the last couple of years, I have been writing and talking about many things connected to the higher education workplace here in the United States, and in particular have been focused on issues related to burnout, disengagement, and demoralization. And so I'm going to pull up and share with you all just a few snippets of data connected to that here in the US context. Our data here at the moment is still a little bit scattered. And so the picture that it reveals is partial, but nevertheless helps to provide a little bit of insight and hopefully a little bit of fodder for discussion. So this was a survey from the Chronicle of Higher Education and Fidelity Investments. And it asked, since the start of 2020, how has your work life changed? And we see that for women, 74% said it had deteriorated, and for men, 63%. Similarly, connected to workload, women, 82% of women who responded said that their workload had increased, and the same was true for 70% of men. Since the start of 2020, have you seriously considered either changing careers and leaving higher ed, changing jobs within higher ed, retiring? We see of respondents anywhere between 35–38%. So from a sheer kind of thinking about intention to leave or change careers within higher education, these are much higher numbers than we would typically see. That varies a little bit depending on faculty or staff. Faculty turnover tends to be much lower than it is for staff, but nevertheless, I know within my own state system, for example, numbers along these lines would be extremely high compared to what the norm would be. Another survey that was conducted by NASPA, which is one of our professional associations for staff who work in student affairs and student services, asked what factors do respondents think contributed to leaving the field. 84% said that the level of stress and crisis management responsiveness required lead to burnout. So again, kind of overwhelming numbers indicating that stress leading to burnout is one of the main factors driving folks out of the student affairs profession. A survey largely of human resources IT professionals here in the state showed that the likelihood of looking for other employment within the next 12 months, 22% said somewhat likely, an additional 12% saying likely, and then 22% saying very likely. So again, within the next 12 months, we're seeing significant numbers of people who are considering looking for new employment. And so I'm going to stop there. We have a couple of other surveys along these lines, but I think the general point is starting to emerge here. What I have argued is that we have a significant amount of movement happening within the higher education sector. That movement, of course, has a significant amount of turbulence across organizations and ripple effects that hopefully we have an opportunity to unpack through this conversation. We have some people who are re-evaluating the place of work in their lives. And so what that may look like is they are asking questions about how much time they have dedicated or have been asked to dedicate to their jobs. They may be dialing back, or in some cases, doing some disengagement as part of a cycle of trying to heal and kind of figure out what their next steps might look like. We have some people who are seeking some type of reassignment. And so that means looking for a new type of position within their college or university, or maybe shifting to a similar role at a different college or university because it's closer to family, or they think it may help them better balance or seek some type of harmony between their work lives and home lives. And then we do have people that are resigning. So they are leaving the field entirely. The possibility of shifting into a new career has been, I think, made possible because there's also a decent amount of movement happening in other sectors that are related to higher ed. And so we have a number of folks, for example, in staff roles that are being recruited into education technology companies because those companies see value in the type of experience that they have, deep experience that they have working with students or working in the higher education sector. And when it comes to trying to either customize or tailor or sell products, that experience is valuable. And naturally, many of those positions come with much better compensation than folks are accustomed to within higher education. So as we start to think about some of the ripple effects or consequences of this movement, we see, for example, a significant number of vacancies at many institutions. Many people who are holding interim roles, so they are temporarily stepping into a leadership position. They may not have had the opportunity to be trained for those positions, and their ability to really move forward or act with the same level of authority as they would have if they were in the role permanently is just not there. And so many colleges and universities aren't necessarily able to move the ball downfield when it comes to reaching certain strategic goals. And so many institutions now are kind of scrambling, looking for ways of trying to address a series of problems that in many ways predate the pandemic. There has occasionally been a tendency when faced with some of these challenges to say, you know what, yeah, the pandemic has been crazy. What are we supposed to do? Or that, yeah, this is happening everywhere. And so, you know, how are we supposed to respond to this when this seems to be something that's just happening across the entire sector? And a big point that I've been trying to hammer home is that yes, the pandemic certainly introduced some new challenges. It altered the nature of work in certain positions entirely. It added workload for a number of people. All of those things are true, but in many ways, the root causes of many of these problems that we're seeing in the higher education workplace here in the United States are deeper and older than the pandemic. And we can start to look at factors like privatization and casualization of labor that have led to job precarity and people not feeling secure in their positions. We can look at austerity and inadequate funding that have led to understaffing issues. So people were already stretched thin in many offices and units and departments prior to the pandemic. And so as people have left, it has meant people taking on, in some cases, multiple jobs or trying to scramble to cover as best they can. We can look to issues related to racism, sexism, elitism within the academy that have made it difficult, if not impossible, for scholars and staff of marginalized identities to feel a sense of belonging, to feel included, and to feel like they have a future where their work is going to be recognized and rewarded. And so as we think about how we move forward with this, my sense is that we will settle in terms of the movement. We will start to see kind of a general diminishing of that movement over time, but those causes that lead to chronic stress and burnout and demoralization are not simply going to disappear. And so the project that I see in front of us is to, irrespective of what happens with immediate turnover or retention numbers, to really start addressing some of those root causes and to design institutions where it's going to be possible for everyone across the organizational chart to feel a sense of belonging, to feel adequately compensated, and to feel like they can flourish. Because by doing all those things, we actually make our institutions stronger and make it possible for us to deliver fully on the promise of higher education. So that's a quick look at how things have played out here in the United States. And I will go ahead and pass things over now to my colleague to share how things, to share a little bit about the work that he's been doing. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Before we pass over to Richard, I just noticed there was a question in the chat as to whether you know if the pre-pandemic statistics look similar. Could you address that just really quickly? Because I think that's a clarification question that's worth taking before we move.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a little bit difficult in all instances to know because, again, we don't necessarily have kind of baseline data that we can use for comparison purposes for all of these things. And there isn't national data within the United States that speaks to many of the workplace issues. We don't have a federal data set, for example, that will provide us with insight into the experiences of employees. That said, based on what we have learned, what I have learned in doing interviews, for example, in my own work, and some of the survey data is that, yes, when it comes to issues around burnout, disengagement, we're seeing elevated numbers. When it comes to issues with turnover, we are seeing elevated numbers than what we would expect as kind of the pre-pandemic norm.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I know there's other questions, we'll get to them after, but for now, I agree. Let's pass the floor to Richard. Are you ready, Richard?
I am almost ready. Play from start. How's that? We're good. We're up and running. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. It's a great pleasure to present you with what's been a period of significant research for me into the impacts and affects of COVID-19 on the wider university staff community of both academics and, as we call them in the United Kingdom, our professional services staff, who constitute another 50% of all our higher education institutions, and how they've been impacted and affected, most especially in terms of their overall well-being, their mental health, their physical welfare and well-being, and what this means for them now in the context of universities and higher education attempting to escape the clasps of COVID-19. And I fully agree with Rebecca when she says we are not out of this pandemic. In fact, we've just recently in my own home experienced COVID for the third time running, and colleagues right across the UK falling down due to this dreadful disease. So we are far from out of it, which makes discussion of the effects of COVID-19 as relates to academic labour especially all the more pertinent, I think. I think I want to present, and I'm going to present mainly UK-based data, and I'll flirt slightly with a few bits of data that we've collected in other country contexts, primarily Australia, South Africa, and also Ireland, our neighbours across the water here. But I'm mainly going to focus on the UK data, and I think it's important before I start to contextualise this data in the context not only of the pandemic and ongoing pandemic experience, but also in the UK context, as a part of the ongoing political turmoil that many of you will no doubt be viewing with disbelief as occurs in our Westminster circus, but also very much connected to the ongoing turmoil caused by Brexit and what that has meant in terms of kind of geopolitical reconfiguration of science and how that has hit the UK. So I think there are these multiple kind of factors that need to be factored in that both in a way mirror but also exacerbate the problems, the wicked problems that we're experiencing in the UK sector and that is affecting deleteriously our academic workforce. So I'm going to start with data that is literally hot off the off our survey instrument, which only closed on Friday. So this is first sight into some of the data that we've collected recently of a survey that asks in the UK of those who have left higher education or are thinking of leaving higher education since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, why they've left, but also why they've left them and what would need to change for them to return. I'm just going to focus because of time restrictions on the reasons they are providing of why they've left or why they're thinking of leaving, rather than the latter. But the latter obviously is crucial in terms of thinking, well, how can we get past and remediate a lot of the problems that seem to be sticky to the sector. So just a quick mention that this involves two excellent co-researchers of mine, one at Bristol and at Swansea University. And the data draws on about 800 completed surveys of both academic and pro-services staff working in UK universities since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a continuation of a wider project, which we're calling Pandemia, and the experience of the pandemic as experienced through the institutional response. And I think there's a qualitative difference here. It's how academics have experienced the pandemic and on their professional lives through the way their institutions have responded to the pandemic and the kinds of measures that have been put in place, a lot of which have to do with things like crisis management and many of the complaints connected with that. So since the outset of the pandemic, we've consulted, actually the figure's higher than this, but we're up to, I think, about 9,000 members of the UK higher education community that we've spoken to try and get a sense of their experiences. And this is just a range of outputs connected with that. What's interesting is I think when we looked across the 4-country context, and we looked at both global North and global South perspectives on the experience of academics and their institutional responses to the pandemic, was not only the complementarity, but essentially the kind of consensus here in terms of how their institutional responses to the pandemic had impacted their health and well-being. So we get, and there's a lot here that mirrors what Kevin's been talking about, severe being the operative word, work intensification experienced across the country context, escalation in terms of job precarization, and increased scarcity, especially we've experienced here in the UK, where the first reaction was to nail down and try and get rid of as many fixed-term contract staff as possible to shore up the finances, given the threat of what the pandemic meant in terms of internationalization and specifically recruitment and retention of international students, upon which so much of our business model is predicated. A lot of this because we saw a rapid shift towards crisis management, forms of non-consultative, non-democratic forms of governance within institutions as a consequence, and an ongoing. We're seeing the continuation of this form of governance within institutions. That's further eroded trust between a rank and file community and senior institutional leadership, and a sense of disenfranchisement, certainly for the former. We also get, again, as Kevin was talking about, a continuation of the deterioration of mental health. It's been well reported, certainly in the UK, that mental health has been a crisis experienced by very much our student community, but also by our staff community, with regrettably many high-profile accounts of staff who've taken their lives as a consequence of work intensification related to also work exploitation and work-based forms of inequality. Which takes me on beautifully to the exacerbation of existing and entrenched inequalities experienced within institutions, especially as experienced by those with protected characteristics. So COVID-19, I think we found through the variety of studies that we've done and through this wide consultation of the UK sector and beyond, has been seen to be something of a wake-up call. These are all things that are not especially new. They've been there for a long time, but I think for once, people were really shunted out of their, shall we say, blindness and comfort zone of ignorance to confront these challenges head on. And the realization being through many of these accounts, and certainly as writ large in this most recent survey, is this sense that the sector is broken, higher education is broken. We get this rationalized on the basis of a model that no longer works, and a changing model that's adopted and embraced new public management technologies, that's focused on markets and massified markets, and also is regulated by forms of work-based cultures that are corrosive, that breed mistrust, but are also disingenuous in so much as they are orienting academic staff and their students towards things other than they might want to focus on in terms of quality. And this in large part rationalized on the basis of a kind of tyranny of metric society, audit culture, surveillance culture, and a lot of what's already been very well written within the literature. But here, crucially, much as also has been reported in the Australian context, the fading allure of academia as a consequence, and increased precarity and the like, as a consequence of government disinterest, if not downright policy hostility. Let's move it along. Again, similar kind of themes here in terms of the kinds of impact on well-being. We've got bullying, we've got cultures of harassment, discrimination, gaslighting, and the like. And these feature heavily. It's quite sobering reading, actually, in terms of this latest survey, in terms of the accounts of people that are rationalizing their move away from higher education context. And the fact that these kinds of behaviors are crucially normalized and legitimized. We have, in fact, we're just about to lurch into further industrial action in the UK related to concerns around pay, progression, pensions, which has been a huge issue in terms of the depreciated values and calculations, erroneous calculations of depreciated value of our pension scheme for UK higher education, and continuation of gendered disadvantage, certainly in terms of fair pay. And again, a lot of these quotes are lifted directly from our survey data and open text questions, which have asked respondents to explain their reasons for leaving. So again, a lot of problems that remain front and center. And it's worth saying that in the UK, even before the pandemic, we were featuring and experiencing significant historical, in fact, industrial action against many of these trends that are being experienced in higher ed, and which are seen to be non-defended by senior management and our institutional leaders within institution, who become very much the bogeymen and the bugbear of the bearers of most criticism in terms of the sector's ills. But a context here of also these management being somewhat Teflon in so much as they're not accountable to many of the injustices that are faced within institutions, at least such as the criticism. And because of this, the perpetuation of a kind of toxic culture, toxic universities, and I think as John Smythe talks about in his book on zombie academics and the like, that this continuation of poor leadership, or in essence, the extension of managerialism and the desertion of proper leadership, empathetic leadership within institutions. Also, what's interesting though, within a lot of the comment that we get from our academics here is the sense that, well, part of this is our own fault. We've been complicit to it. We've turned a blind eye to it. There's maybe much more that we could have done and should be doing. And again, referring back to pandemia, as we've called it, as this kind of wake-up bomb, that this is shunting people towards taking more kind of collectivized forms of action against the collusion that they have been a part of. Let's move along. Some of the other really worrying things within this, and many of I've often reflected on this, the fact that actually if I was to move outside of the sector, where would I get employment? We've become in many respects horribly institutionalized, especially those further on into their academic careers. And one only needs to take a look at academic CVs to get a sense to which the ability to sell oneself as employable to other sectors is heavily compromised. And we get these accounts thus within that talk about the sense of having been institutionalized, of becoming unemployable, and therefore being trapped, and trapped also because of personal social circumstances, having mortgages, commitments, and other kinds of domestic responsibilities. Okay, but if we were to wrap all these together, and you will have to forgive me, this is literally data that closed, our survey closed on Friday, so it's a very quick and rough analysis of what we're beginning to see here. But if we were to pull together some of the kind of core themes here that are that are pointing to why we're seeing this, if there isn't this kind of concern towards a rush towards the exit door, which actually has been just addressed by the outgoing Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, who's talking about a brain drain from UK academia. We see these kinds of things happening. We remain and have a hyper-competitive labour market. Just the other day, I was on an appoints committee where I was you're just overwhelmed by the number of applications that are coming through from an absolute surplus of doctoral talent. And there just aren't the positions to cater for the number of highly talented individuals that want to still come through for some reason to a job in academia. We've also got, as Kevin's already alluded to, issues around staff precarization and casualization. We've got workforce inequality related to gendered pathways, ceilings, and unequal burden, especially true for female researchers who have held back. And I think a major finding that we found was the extent to which female researchers through the pandemic took a disproportionate share of the pastoral and intensified pastoral role within universities. We've got a mental health crisis that we claim has been, and is very palpably seen to be exacerbated by pandemia, the experience of the pandemic. And we're now also seeing the impacts of long COVID, which are very, very poorly understood in present context. We've got breakdown of trust accentuated by pandemia. and the continuation in many institutions and across different higher education systems of a persistence with crisis management. We've got, as we are doing now, a blended form of working, many people are still getting their heads around. Some of us are still doing the vast majority of our work through the glass wall. How do we work that in the context of not only our research, our teaching, our administration, our leadership? These are questions that still to be worked through. In the UK, especially, we have a hostile policy environment and a government that is in large part very apathetic, if not downright hostile to what universities do. We've also got fear of sector contraction and increased stratification, especially as relates to the challenge of digitalization and the digitalization of higher education, and what may come from new higher education challenges entering the marketplace. We do have, despite having significant hyper-competitive labour market, we do have significant major workforce attrition. And we've also, as a consequence, I think, as many people have studied, as a consequence of Brexit, seen diaspora of UK academics to other international settings. But the problem with all of this is higher education remains dictated to according to kind of prestige economics and a prestige economic rationale in terms of what we do. Value, and the way we value things is dominated by what I call competitive accountability. In higher education. There's a whole other thing on that, and I'm very conscious of already running over time. And as I mentioned, in terms of this, the change in nature and the context in which higher education is being digitalized, we've got the promise, but also the potential significant threat of EdTech and the challenges which that raised in terms of thinking through platformized futures, the challenges of how we do dedication, assetization, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, worth mentioning that I've just presented mainly qualitative excerpts of stuff from a UK perspective, but we have also in track a international project that covers 9 different country contexts, which is specifically focused on long COVID or post-COVID syndrome, as it's also called, to begin to understand how long COVID plays a part in terms of the transformation of higher education, its labour force, and also as a factor in the context of this potential great resignation. Thanks very much, Rebecca. So many apologies for going over, no doubt.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Kevin. I think we've already got a lot of really good questions in the chat, and I have a few as well. Richard, if you wouldn't mind stopping your share, then we can see you. There we go. So I'm going to try and combine a few, but I also want to encourage those of you who haven't asked questions, do feel free to bring them in as they occur to you. I guess I want to start with the question that we put as the subtitle for the webinar today, which is, are we talking about some sort of long-term trend that we need to do something about as a sector, or is this a COVID-related blip in the landscape that, we know that COVID was a massive disruption that made many things very different from what they were before, and in some ways will not last. But there's a question as to whether this is something that we think will last. Obviously, both of you have talked about the fact that there were a lot of things going on before the pandemic that already were making people feel burnt out, were making people feel like they didn't have the right work-life balance, were making people feel disgruntled. Certainly the UK has had many years of strikes, etc. So we have evidence that a lot of these feelings were felt before the pandemic period that maybe then just kind of forced a lot of people to question. Do we have evidence that this will continue, or is it the people who were going to question have now questioned and we're going to move on? So do either of you want to come in on that long-term versus not? Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but what's your feeling at this point? Kevin, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So I think my short answer is that this is going to be a long-term phenomenon within higher education, even if there are certain elements of it that we might attribute to being more of a blip, in the sense that there are certain experiences, feelings that are more acute or have been more acute in the last couple of years just by virtue of what we've experienced. But as Richard and I both agree that there are root causes here that predate the pandemic, and therefore suggest that this has already been a trend. And I don't anticipate that those things are going to magically go away, especially since, to be honest with you, I don't know that I could point to that many institutions that have been really innovating or strategically addressing many of these issues. And so that suggests to me that we're likely going to see many of them continue on. With respect to, specifically issues around turnover or retention, again, I do think that we're probably going to see some of those numbers level out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people are doing well in their jobs. It doesn't mean that our organizations are healthy. It doesn't mean that we are fully maximizing the potential of our institutions, because we have not ever really treated working conditions and cultures as being something that's important. It has always been an afterthought. For many years, I think we've been able to bank on the fact that there are many people that are interested in working at our colleges and universities. And there was a question around, for example, competition for academic jobs in particular, and how we perhaps could get away with treating people poorly because there was always somebody that was willing to take that position. First of all, I don't think that's been true for all positions in higher education, right? There are some that have been hyper competitive, and some where we have always had to work really hard to fill certain roles, especially in certain staff roles in the US. But moving forward, I think that premise that there is always going to be someone that's willing to step up and it's going to be the best that we could possibly get is no longer in play. I think there are people that are going to be asking a different set of questions. We've got some folks that are in PhD programs, for example, that are saying, I don't want to go into academia, when maybe that would have been something I was interested in the past. I think COVID is going to have a long tail. We're going to see effects from this for a long period of time. And that could be in the form of the continuation of chronic illness or effects to people's physical health. But it also has a long tail in terms of the mental health effects, because we have not really had a chance to have a break and to process and to grieve, at least in the United States, I think, in any kind of meaningful way. And we're seeing the long tail also play out in terms of some real concerns around enrollment and our ability to continue to make gains in terms of access and retention and completion for students that have oftentimes met roadblocks in their path to higher ed. That's going to have ripple effects for faculty and staff for many years to come if we've got institutions that are under-enrolled and poorly funded and thinly staffed. This notion of being able to step into higher education work and define this as a place where I'm cared for and where I'm able to enact the values that brought me into this work, I think is some of the big questions that I have as in terms of longer term trends.
Thanks, Kevin. Richard, do you want to come in on that from the UK side or any of the other contexts where you've worked?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going to start with the saying that many of you will probably no doubt be familiar with, that the definition of success in academia is being awarded more work, which I think holds true. We've got this culture of hyper-professionality, and we've got a culture of people that celebrate and valorize excessive forms of working. And so for me, I think that part of this is no great surprise. The pandemic just threw a significant spotlight on it and really caused us to address the impacts of this so much more, because the scale of the disruption to our lives was unprecedented, right? So I think this just took it to a different level that's consequently caused people not only in higher education but so many different forms of labor to question what it is they do, how they work, and the rewards and fulfillment and satisfaction they gain from it. I think your question about, is this going to change? I mean, I agree first off with every point that Kevin has made, and I would further think that through in terms of the stickiness of these problems, in terms of the immediate challenges, for instance, of digitalization, which I think is huge, how we do hybridization, and how our work is being reorganized accordingly because of that. This so-called snapback, we're seeing it in part, but also we are fumbling our way through developing and adapting to what will surely be a prolonged way of working now, especially in the context of what some people think of as this kind of era of pandemics, and in anticipation of whatever may come next. The other long-term thing, I think, certainly in the UK context, is a political one, and in essence, it requires us to rethink the business model, right? How do we rationalize the value and purpose and point of higher education? To what extent can we go back, not necessarily go back, to what extent can we embrace more of a public good model that moves away from the hegemony of a market-based rationalization of higher education? So in other words, can we demarketize higher education? And to what extent could that be related to the amelioration of the terms of employment and the overall experience of higher education from the student's perspective? The one point that I thought Kevin was absolutely spot on and was so abundantly clear within this latest survey was the failure of our higher education institutions to innovate in the context of thinking through welfare, well-being, health, all of these kinds of things, to implant an ethic of care and to abide by an ethic of care. It's just not there. So, you know, we get these sound bites of things, but those sound bites never really follow through. And I think that the final thing I want to say is beyond the kind of business model change and we need regulatory revision, right? I think a lot of the processes of our regulation just do not work, is the other thing. But the other thing the last thing that I wanted to think of is where do we go from here in the context of a widespread evidence of quiet quitting? Right, there's much that's being talked about this that's across all sectors. As I said, how much will this last, and how much can this last in a time of severe economic disruption and concern? And that's something that we're very much feeling in the UK context. And what does that mean, crucially, therefore, for leadership? And I think the leadership debate is something that's missing. We've done a lot, and as is incredibly well evidenced within these survey responses, you know, there is a real sense of leadership that has gone astray, that we've too far embraced managerialism within universities, but without consideration of leadership and the kinds of leadership that we want, we deserve, and we aspire to within institutions that may help to remediate many of the problems that are causing this suggested great resignation.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think Richard's point, by the way, about policy and politics certainly applies to the US context as well. It's been obviously we got a number of people working in higher education who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of truth, to being able to develop scientific knowledge and apply that, for example, in a public health crisis. And at the same time, we are operating in a context where you know, widespread misinformation, where people deny basic scientific truth, where policies are being designed and enacted without taking into account, you know, the real expertise that we have within our colleges and universities, and it's incredibly demoralizing. We've got obviously policies in many states where there are efforts to control or censor what's being taught in the classroom. And again, it kind of comes back around to this question of, is this a place where I feel like I can enact my values? And policy and politics are a factor, certainly in the US, that are making folks say that it is not possible in the context of, for example, public higher education for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, and certainly there's synergies in both of you're saying in terms of the long-term sort of what has been brewing for a long time in terms of dissatisfaction, demoralization, concerns with that broader context, inequalities, et cetera, that have been exacerbated by this moment, but that might continue in many ways. I'm looking at the various questions we have, and I'm trying to group them. It seems like we have a group of questions around difference of experience, and we have a group of questions around implications. I want to be sure we address both of those in the last 15 minutes, because I think they're both really important. So the first one, I'm picking up a number of questions about how this may differ depending on what we're talking about. And so certainly, if we talk about academics, faculty members choosing to leave and what that looks like versus staff who might be choosing to leave and what that looks like, there are different drivers. There are also different ways that the leaving might happen. and they're quite different also in terms of that competitive hiring environment you were just talking about. So there's a difference in terms of type of position, but also I would imagine a difference in terms of type of institution. Is one of the implications of this going to be that certain institutions continue to recruit because they are who they are in the pecking order, and other institutions just fail to bring people in when people leave? Will there be an institutional difference that we can observe moving forward? So I think there's a question there. And then there's a much bigger question around implications. So what do we do about all of this? And I'm noticing there's a question, Kelber asked a question about what does this mean for training of future higher education professionals? Do we, there are institutions who are lowering the requirement for a master's, for example, because they just want someone in the role. So what is that going to mean for all of our programs that we run for training higher education professionals? Are we going to run out of a need for that? Is it going to be that kind of large implication? So that's one piece of it. Another piece looking through this is that, we talked about transferability, again, thinking about academics versus staff. Perhaps some of those positions can move in an easier way than others can move. And so what does that mean? Will there be differences that way? And then the last point I want to bring up is, we talked about difference in terms of academic staff versus professional staff, difference in terms of institution, but also are there really big differences based on context? Obviously, the two of you are mostly talking about two big contexts. I know, Richard, you have some data from a number of others in your survey, but there are also other international experiences of this. Of course, it will look different in different parts of the world. And I know you yourselves have not necessarily looked at that, but what is your sense of how global this is? Or is this certain sectors that have been at a tipping point that are now really reacting? Or is this a problem across higher education? I just threw a lot of different questions because what I'd love is for you to pick up on the things of that are of interest to you or you feel you can speak to, just to be sure that we kind of cover the breadth of interest that we've got coming through the participants. Kevin, can I hand it to you first?
Yeah, so I'll toss out just a couple of random things. Maybe they'll come together cohesively, we'll see. But I'm going to try to keep it brief because I know that we don't have a ton of time. And right off the bat, I'll say US institutions are very much, racialized hierarchies, and there are incredible differences in terms of job benefits, compensation, autonomy, depending on where you sit in that hierarchy. And so I'm thinking in my work primarily about folks that are in staff roles where compensation issues have been the worst, where they have the least amount of autonomy. That's not to say that there are not big issues for faculty and academics. There certainly are. But in a broad general sense, many institutions have done a better job of attending to the working conditions of faculty than they have of people in other positions. And so what that means, and just by virtue of that particular job market, there are still people that are very interested in faculty jobs. We will still see lots of applicants for those jobs. Some of the issues around the Great Resignation apply to faculty, but certain elements of them do not apply as cleanly, I think. So that is one piece of this, certainly, is that as we're talking about the Great Resignation in higher ed, who are we talking about? I think that really matters in terms of the issues and the types of solutions that we might come up with. There are absolutely, certainly within US higher education, we have stratification by institution type. There are institutions that have the resources to be able to address this in a way where, people that are working there can see some real material differences, and institutions who say, we were stretched thin resource-wise prior to the pandemic. Maybe now we are seeing some enrollment challenges, retention challenges. We are stretched thinner than we were. We don't have that emergency funding that we can fall back on. And so we are looking at potentially losing more people by virtue of budget cuts and leaning more heavily on short-term or part-time labor. And so, yes, we are going to see a trend of the haves of US higher education having more and the have-nots having less. Part of that comes back to a point Richard made, which is from a policy perspective, higher education has not been a priority, and attempting to ensure the future of some of our, for example, broad access institutions that have not been resourced has not been a priority. I'll pause there and pass it over to Richard. I certainly have thoughts around kind of implications and what we do with this. And so hopefully we can come back around to that. But I'm just curious to hear kind of where he's at with this.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, the quality control question for me, there's so much of this comes back to the kind of business model that we've got, but also the fragility of public funding for higher education. And in the UK, this is especially problematic at the moment in terms of what is seen to be a suspected return to politics of austerity in the distribution of public funds, for which higher education is, despite claims of the maintenance of a significant tranche of money for science and research and development, we'll probably lose out here. What does that mean in terms of quality control, in terms of how we teach, what we teach, the research that we commit to? Well, it potentially jeopardizes it, right? The problem with that jeopardization is it potentially plays further into the hands of unsympathetic government, who are already doing a very good job of questioning the value proposition of higher education and what it's needed for and what its public benefit is. So I think it's a kind of circular problem. I think in terms of the divergent experiences of staff across universities, if we were to kind of differentiate, say, for instance, between faculty and non-academics, what we would pro services, as we call them in the UK, I think there is real difference in terms of their kind of labour-based mobility. For instance, if you look at non-academic or professional services staff, they've got probably quite a lot of horizontal mobility, but they've got really poor vertical mobility in terms of being able to go up, and in terms of structures for promotion, career development, and all the rest of it, they're just really, really poorly represented. And actually, we recently did a survey in the UK that spoke to the direct experiences of people in those positions, who talked about living at work, but also the inescapability of living at work, because they have no recourse to any kind of methods of sanctioning or collective mobilization against these pressures. They're not they are unionized, but they're not in the same successful way that the academic community is. So there's a kind of more diminished voice there in terms of objection and mobilization against some of these difficulties that they're experiencing. And I think the other last bit, my thought that I'm going to throw out here is in terms of the differences across an academic hierarchy, which raises questions. We're making an assumption here that everyone can leave. Well, they can't necessarily, and I think that's what's come through from our survey. Those that feel that actually, they're unemployable, or they've got these external domestic pressures that they've got to respond to. So who are the people that actually can afford to leave and can transition into other forms of alternative employment, And I think this depends again on a different kind of skill sets. Are there academics there, for instance, who, if they were to leave academia, will they be able to make that efficient transition into industry or business, or do they have the entrepreneurial skill sets that might allow them to do those kinds of things? So I think this is an individuated thing, as well as an institutional variation, as well, of course, to sector level variation. And in terms of that picture across the world, to how similar and how complementary is this picture? Well, I think certainly in heavily marketized and neoliberalized sectors it is, and I think that's what we really found. Those sectors that are already heavily neoliberalized, and also those that are increasingly being neoliberalized, are those where these kinds of issues appear to be endemic. So I think that's not to discount the fact that there will be differences, but I think there is strong commonality across those sectors in terms of the kinds of experiences that we've described that are heavily marketized and neoliberalized and have a very corporatized kind of model of operation.
Thank you. Shall we finish with implications? And I want to offer up the possibility of ending on a positive note, if you'd like. Kelber did ask in the chat if you have seen any data of institutions that have addressed this well, or have thought about humanizing the experience of the humans within their institutions in any way. If you don't, that's fine. But an open invitation to talk about implications, but also bring in that positive thing if you have anything to leave us with on an upward note. Kevin, do you want to start us?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that it's not all bad for everybody. There are a lot of people who, still have had a positive experience working in higher ed, still love their jobs, plan to continue in their careers. And so as we were talking about these big issues, it's not the case that, it is a universal experience, right? And so there are, I think, institutions and campus communities that are strong, that have benefited from good leaders that have been there at the institutions for a long period of time, and they have been able to cultivate organizational cultures where people enjoy working there, want to stay working there, are able to attract people. Many institutions in direct response to some of the issues that we've talked about today have looked into increasing compensation. And so that is one instrument, of course, because compensation is an issue. That one is a little bit easier, I have found, for the leaders that I have talked to kind of wrap their heads around, a little bit more concrete than something like organizational change, which I think gets lost a little bit amidst kind of competing priorities, or they don't know quite how to operationalize that. I have been really pushing the idea that in higher ed, we need to have a true, at a particular institution, you need to have a true talent management strategy, which means recognizing that you have not just faculty, but also staff that are talented, that you want to keep, and that you're not just going to replace with whoever else might be willing to step into that role. And so, yes, although this is slightly ironic, given that we were talking about issues connected to privatization and neoliberalism, but there are companies and other knowledge organizations that have been thinking about talent management for a long period of time, and we could learn something from some of those other organizations. I'm not saying a wholesale adoption of some of those ideas, but the simple idea that we need to make sure that the jobs that we're offering are good opportunities, that there's career mobility and career pathways, that we recognize that adults want to learn and be challenged and grow on the job, that we have to have regular increases in salary to account for cost of living, that people are not necessarily able to stay in the same job for 15 years without any type of change or promotion. So some of these principles that exist elsewhere that are somewhat foreign to higher education are ones that we need to give serious thought to. And I think we can do that in a way that doesn't involve kind of wholesale abandonment of our principles.
Thanks, Kevin. Any final words from you, Richard?
I'm not sure I can add much more to that. I think Kevin has done a sterling job there. I think the only thing I would say is, yeah, there are, and I think the experience in terms of that we're not without hope. It's not completely desolate. And I think what we've really, certainly in the UK, what I've experienced was a kind of springwell of compassion and camaraderie, of coming together through the difficulties that we've all experienced and continue to experience during the pandemic. And I'm reminded, I've now had COVID about 3 times, and I'm still struggling with long COVID, and I'm continually reminded of the extraordinary collegialism that's been shown to me by colleagues. Now, there's an expression of how we can work to resolve many of these issues. It's more of a kind of bottom-up, an organic approach that needs to be really taken up to a discussion around leadership. Because I think the major complaint that we've had throughout the experience of the pandemic is that leadership in many respects has been absent. We've had management, but we haven't had leadership, certainly at the most senior levels. And I think what's really important, and we've got it in the UK at the moment, we've just finished a project working with Advance HE that asks, what kind of leadership do we want for higher education? And we need a whole community approach to understanding that and engaging with that, because it's a collective responsibility, right? If we want to imagine and if we want to implement a better future for higher education, and one that gets rid of many of the ills and woes that we've described this afternoon, then that demands a kind of collective response and a collective responsibility. And equally, I think our higher education leaders need to be much, much more proactive in terms of challenging those within a policy and a political context, which we see very little of. We see a lot of acquiescence, but not a lot and a lot of timidity, but not much else. And there are obvious reasons and challenges and constraints that can rationalize that. But we need a better, stronger, more coordinated and collectivized coming together.
Thank you so much to both of you. Also, just a note, Hans mentioned a Dutch higher education policy in the chat. If you're interested in another positive example, just to end with some positive messages coming out of what is not necessarily a very positive message in general. But thank you so much. This has been very interesting. I think we could easily have spent 4 hours on the topic. Clearly, if nothing else, the experience of the last few years has maybe reminded those of us working in higher education that we can idealize our sector sometimes, and it's easy to forget that there are some really significant challenges that the people within higher education have long been facing, but definitely still are facing, that need to be addressed in order to make sure that we are, as you said, Kevin, that we have the higher education institutions we want to have for the people within them, students as well as faculty and staff. It'll be very interesting to watch the space to see what's going to happen in the future, to see what the data shows us in terms of people leaving or perhaps not leaving and changing the way that they work or what have you, and how it will depend by context. Because of course, I've been struck as you've been talking about all the many contextual pieces that affect this, whether that's policy or access to resource, access to collective bargaining, all kinds of other questions that depend on the context and how that will be, how each sector will respond to the challenges that you've outlined. But thank you so much. Kevin's posted a link in the chat if you want some more ideas for change. I will also put up here that our next webinar will be in about a month's time on November the 15th. We're looking at the role of academic diaspora in global higher education at that time, and we'd love to see you for that and other future events. If you're not yet on our mailing list, do shoot us an email. I'll put the email in here and let us know, and we'll add you so that you receive the information straight into your inbox. But otherwise, I'll just close by thanking both of our speakers so much for your time today, and to remind everybody this has been recorded, so we will put it up on the our YouTube channel in due course, so that you can watch back and look at the slides if you're interested in the data that they shared. But just really thank you so much for spending your time with us today, Richard and Kevin, and thank you for the rest of us for joining us. We'll see you next time, hopefully. Bye-bye.